A lot of places lost deer this year, but think how many they would have lost had they not had any cool season food plots like we now have. A lot of people in the last 20 years have started planting cool season plots for deer, and I do think that has helped them get over the bad spots of the winter and come into spring in better shape, and that has got to lead to a statistical improvement in the odds of growing these super bucks. Why we've only seen it on the non-typical side and not so much typical, I have no idea, but I do think generational stunning and the reversal of generational stunning has clearly been an impact because, again, the Germans saw it 400 years ago. The stunning that they saw over time with lack of nutrition, they realized that with proper nutrition, they could reverse it. And again, even in red deer, it took about 3 generations to see it. But once they saw it, it was a, quote, permanent cure as long as the food was still there.
Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 275. Gordon Whittington, the emerging 300-inch. Support for the Big Buck Registry and the Deer Hunt Podcast comes from Rackology. Everything you need in one bag. Now available at Rural King and Orslin Farm and Home storefronts or online at www.rackology.org. Minus 33 merino wool layering system. Timeless natural insulation, keeping you warm on the coldest days while staying breathable and wicking away moisture on the wet ones without the old school itch of regular wool. Grizzly Ears, the most advanced engineered wireless earbuds for the outdoors. Covert scouting cameras, remote cameras for hunting, wildlife, and security. QuietKat, the all-terrain electric bicycle. Visit quietkat.com. That's QUIETKAT.com and use the discount code BIGBUCK15 to secure 15% off your next QuietKat purchase. And Big Buck merch. You can get cool, high-quality Big Buck t-shirts, long-sleeve t-shirts, and hoodies. And show support for this podcast by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/MERCH. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
Hi there, it's Scott Perkins from Bearded Butcher Blend Seasoning, and you're listening to one of my favorite podcasts, the Big Buck Registry.
Hey, this is JC Hall from On the Road and Open Season TV, and you're listening to one of my favorite podcasts, the Big Buck Registry.
Hey, this is Harmon Carson with New Life Taxidermy, and you're listening to the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow predators. My name is Jay, and thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. For Dusty Phillips and Jim Keller and the entire staff here at the Big Buck Registry, welcome to this week's show. There are a couple things I'd like you to do for us if you could. If you would, please check us out on iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. With your help, we're going to try and push this show up the iTunes charts. I know we have a lot of listeners out there, and I need you to take some action. I need you to leave a review and subscribe to the show. If you do subscribe, that'll give you access and notification each and every week that a new show is released. You can also access this show in its entirety on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. It's all right there for you to access on demand at your fingertips. Regarding the harness program, we have an ample supply of harnesses to give away from our volunteer donors. If you're in need of a full-body harness, please send an email to j@bigbuckregistry.com. There have been far more 300-inch non-typical bucks killed since the early 2000s than ever documented before the year 2000. So what gives? Gordon Whittington, the editor-in-chief of North American Whitetail, joins us for a second time to explore just that. Is it genetics? Is it food? What can history tell us from hundreds of years ago? What about the big deer that came in the decades before the new millennium? We discuss all this in detail and dig deep into the Luke Brewster buck story, the monster Illinois buck from 2018, currently featured in North American Whitetail Magazine. We'll get to our entire interview with Gordon Whittington in just one moment, but before we do, let's hear from our friends at Rackology. minus 33 merino wool products, and Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Hey, it's Eric Fitzgerald here with Rackology. Wanted to visit you briefly about one of the most exciting products that we got in the market with Rackology. This is our food plot fertilizer. You can supplement your deer right through your food plot with this product. This is not your normal NPK. This has got so many goodies in this bag. Basically what it does is it makes your soil work for you so you can get by with just using fertilizer like this and not a lot of synthetics. If you want a good food plot and you want deer coming in and healthy plants, look at the food plot fertilizer through Rackology. Check us out at rackology.org. Thanks for tuning in.
Let's talk about a hunter's layering system for a sec. We need to be ready for any weather that Mother Nature throws at us. With the layering concepts that Minus 33 has created with their incredible merino wool products, they've got you covered. The Minus 33's merino wool expedition weight garments will keep you warm on the coldest late season days while regulating and wicking away moisture in a way that only merino wool can do. You see, wool will absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without leaving you feeling wet or clammy, and wool insulates better than cotton or polyester and protects against hypothermia on those late season hunts. And here's another interesting point. You might not think of wool for early season, but with the Minus 33 wicking technology, I'll take a lightweight Minus 33 base layer any day in warm weather. Merino wool fibers naturally reject any bacteria found in moisture or sweat and gives you double protection against odor as your target buck approaches. Visit www.minus33.com to learn more about Minus 33's layering technology. Use the code BIGBUCK33 to get 10% off your next order.
Now here's Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Our first story this week, Colorado Parks and Wildlife cracked down on illegal antler collecting. This story is from the KJCT8.com website and was reported by Sierra Ferguson. You could face steep fines if you're caught collecting shed antlers in western Colorado. The season for shed hunting will open on May 1st. Since January 1st, restrictions on collecting shed antlers have been in effect on all public lands west of Interstate 25. Those restrictions go through April 30th. Additional restrictions apply in the Gunnison Basin. The new season guidelines were launched last year, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife say they focus on educating the public. Now they're shifting that focus to enforcement. If you're caught collecting antlers before May 1st, you could be cited, fined, and have points marked against your hunting or fishing license. Why has the season been adjusted? To protect deer and elk across the state. According to the CPW Public Information Officer Mike Porras, shed hunters have been putting pressure on the wildlife while they're at their most vulnerable. Shed hunters, Porras said, might not be the only people recreating on public lands and potentially disturbing wildlife, but shed hunters, unlike other forms of recreation, can be regulated to reduce stress for the animals. According to Porras, by May, the landscape should be greener, grazing conditions should improve. Often elk and deer move to higher elevations. This makes it less dangerous for herds to come in contact with humans, like those that are hoping to find their antlers. Hunter in Washington sets world record for Shiras moose. This story is from the Fox News website and was reported by Michael Barterimo. A hunter in Washington recently learned that he set a world record with a moose he bagged back in November. Jim Hall from Buckley was out hunting with a friend, Jason Parlari, in Ferry County on November 28th when they encountered a Shiras moose on the last valid day of Hall's month-long tag, which he had finally received after applying for more than 30 years. Only after taking the moose down did Hall and his friend realize the magnitude of the situation. "I'm just in awe," he told the Statesman Review, adding that he estimated the Shiras moose to weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 to 700 pounds. "I'm texting pictures to people and all my friends are freaking out." Another buddy suggested Hall share news of the extraordinary hunt with the Safari Club International, which later determined the moose's points measured a combined 242 inches for a score of 504 and 7/8, or 1 1/8 inches more than enough to qualify as a new Safari Club world record for Shiras moose. While officially a Safari Club record, however, the Statesman Review notes that the Shiras moose came in at about the 60th largest according to the Boone and Crockett's club scoring system, as they both take different factors into account. Opening day change is official for Pennsylvania deer hunters. This story is from the TribLive.com website and was reported by Bob Fry. The change, and it's a big one, is official. Opening day of Pennsylvania's statewide firearms deer season is moving. It has been the Monday after Thanksgiving each year since 1963. This year it will be the Saturday after Thanksgiving. In changing things, game commissioners cited the possibility a Saturday opener could potentially boost hunting license sales and participation by making their sport more accessible to college students and working people. Surveys on the popularity of the change did not show that this decision was necessarily popular with many hunters. Whether it's the right decision or not is hard to predict. Answers about its impact on the future for hunting in the state, good or bad, likely won't come for a few years. Tennessee hunter bags rare white turkey of a lifetime. This story is from the Fox News website and reported by Michael Bartiromo. A hunter in Rutherford County, Tennessee, managed to bag the turkey of a lifetime less than a week into the state's hunting season. On April 6, Cameron Bond of Warren County shot and killed the wild-looking turkey, which reportedly had a condition known as leucism, resulting in a partial loss of pigmentation, according to the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. The bird weighed 20 pounds with a 9.5-inch beard and 3.25-inch spurs. News of Bond's rare turkey follows that of a hunter in Mississippi who bagged a leucistic gobbler in mid-March. That hunter, as well as the newspaper that initially interviewed him, the Clarion Ledger, came under fire from TV commentator and ESPN personality Keith Olbermann, who called for his Twitter followers to make the turkey hunter's life a living hell. Olbermann had also expressed his desire for the writer of the interview to be fired from the Clarion Ledger. ESPN later confirmed that it had spoken to Olbermann about making personal attacks. He later apologized for his tweets. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. Special thanks to Daniel Applebaum and John Geis for leads on stories this week. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have any questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Thanks to Jim Keller for the Deer News. Without further ado, here is Gordon Whittington. Gordon Whittington, welcome back to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, my friend?
I am doing great, Jay. It's another good year to be a deer hunter.
Last time we had you on the show was back in 2015. It was episode 106. And anybody that's listening, go back and listen to that. We talked a lot about kind of your upbringing, your past, how you got into the position you're in at North American Whitetail. So if you want to go listen to that show, that's where we covered all of Gordon's backstory. And we brought you back today, Gordon, because I want to talk about last year. I want to talk about all the highlights of 2018. There's certainly lots to talk about, and I thought of no better person to really sum up some of the big highlights of 2018 than yourself.
Well, I tell you, I don't get in the field as many days as I once did, and that's just for various reasons, but I do try to keep up with things as best possible. And here at North American Whitetail, that's, we're always getting reports from the field, and sometimes it's from our writers, and sometimes it's from our TV team, and people like Dr. James Kroll, obviously well-known biologist, but a lot of times it's just from the public. I mean, we're hearing from so many hunters and land managers, and that really does help us, even when we're not in the field on a given day. It does give us a good chance to kind of, if you will, take the temperature of what's going on out there.
Gotcha. If you had to summarize in one word what 2018 was, what would you say?
I'd say it's a pretty good season.
Okay.
I mean, I realize that's more than one word, but let's just go with good.
Close enough. Pretty good season. So what does that mean? Where are the hot spots of topics of conversation within the U.S. that warrants a conversation?
Well, here's the thing. When you say a season is good, bad, or otherwise, you're always basing that off of some at least mental norm, if you will. Say, well, what's an average year? Well, you ask the, quote, average hunter, and he'll say, well, we see the same number of deer, we fill the same number of tags, with the deer we shoot are about the same size, and the weather conditions, everything's kind of, quote, average. Well, again, that's, by definition, average is got highs, lows, and in-betweens, and so you really can't even say that means anything that you can quantify.
Right.
However, if we just look at a several-year trend and talk about deer populations, deer sightings, deer harvest, the size of bucks being taken, those things seem to be pretty encouraging in 2018. I think a lot of people felt like it was a, quote, good season. That's why I use the word good to characterize it. I just feel like it was not it wasn't record-breaking. The days of record-breaking harvest, if you will, harvest totals on deer, I think are largely over because we've seen those populations rebound and in some cases level off and in some cases fall off, intentionally or otherwise. But in general, you're not going to see these annual headlines anymore of, most deer ever shot in fill-in-the-blank state. I think those days are largely behind us, but maybe they should be behind us because we reached some really high deer population densities in a lot of places that the habitat really was not necessarily suited to sustain that number of deer in good health. And so once those populations dropped back a little bit, as many of them did the early part of this decade, whether that was EHD, which is a big part of it, predators, too many does being shot in some states. They got a little bit too aggressive with their doe harvest. Multiple factors involved there, and certainly drought in parts of the Great Plains in the early part of the decade. Many of those things contributed to a fall off in deer numbers, whether it was a high harvest, whether it was a low recruitment of fawns, whether it was just a lot of predation losses. And again, EHD being kind of its own predator, if you will, killed hundreds of thousands of deer annually. Then when you put several of those things together, those deer numbers get knocked down a little bit. It takes them a while to build back up, even if those problems that caused the decline suddenly go away. It still takes a while to rebuild that herd. So I think we're seeing a surging population now in many places compared to 5 or 6 years ago, and especially 7 or 8 years ago. And so if you say that means that it's a good season, maybe it's good compared to the last several years, because I think that is largely the case.
Gotcha. So good compared to recent years, but not like record-breaking like you'd see 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. If you look back to like 2005 and you look at the population for all of North America, Jay, probably was maybe a little over 30 million whitetails.
Okay.
And again, that's, nobody's out there counting them all. We know that, but that's just a projection based on the best available estimates. And we knew that it had gotten to be a high number. Yet, if you look by, let's say, 2012 or 2013, I think it had probably dropped off by maybe 4, 5, 6 million from that high watermark. Now, we both know that hunters and fishermen alike will tend to look at the best year, the best day, the best hunt or fishing trip they ever had, and that over time kind of becomes the baseline for them as to what good is. Okay?
Yeah.
Well, we used to see 100 deer in this bean field, and now we only see 40. And then, okay, what's wrong with our deer herd? Well, Grandpa remembers when there were 3 deer. And to him, 40
Right.
is incredible. But to you saw 100, so 40 is terrible. And so it's all, so much of it is psychological and mental as far as hunters' expectations and feelings about how good a shape is the resource in, or how good is the quality of the hunting or fishing. And again, we will tend, human nature, I guess, to try to look at the best we've ever seen as being some hoped-for norm, but it rarely is. It may be just as much of an outlier as the times when we saw very few deer. And maybe the norm, if you will, is somewhere in the middle, and I think that's really where the deer herd overall in North America is today. It's somewhere in the middle between that super high elevated level of maybe 15 years ago and the really low level we saw maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay. It's interesting to kind of conceptualize. Can deer densities get too thick to the point where the disease can overcome the benefits of having so many? I mean, if you have 30 million deer and they're all exposed, does it say something for a smaller population?
Well, certain deer diseases, and I'm not a biologist, pathologist, epidemiologist, or whatever kind of ologist there are. I mean, I'm not any of those things, but right. I will just say, as a layman observer of deer hunting and being involved in it professionally from the hunting and management standpoint for many years, I do feel like there's no question there are some density-dependent diseases that are largely spread by close contact of animals. Bovine tuberculosis, obviously named for being in cattle, but it also can affect deer. And in places like Michigan, we've seen that, where bovine TB if you get close contact of animals regularly, it does tend to have a higher infection rate because it just is transmitted more easily. If deer are separated physically, they tend, whether by low density or fencing or anything else like that, then you have less chance for the disease to spread. So there is something to be said for high densities of animals in certain cases to contributing to more, if you will, contagious diseases. It's like a person with the flu gets on the subway. Well, maybe a bunch of people get the flu. I mean, and whereas if they were out in a small town, maybe nobody gets it, So it's the same thing really with deer. I do think that in general, we overplay the disadvantages of high deer numbers. If you think about it, there's two ways to look at overpopulation. One is that you have too many animals. The other one is that you have too few resources for those animals. In fact, we saw that 25 years ago now here in Georgia when we restocked a research facility that had no deer in it. We put a ton of food out there. We grew all kinds of crops, and we let a very small number of deer develop on their own through their own internal recruitment to be a very high density of animals. Within a 2,000-acre facility, we eventually reached a point where we had a deer per 2 acres, which you'd say, well, that's unsustainable. That's just way too many deer. At the same time, the native habitat within the facility was actually improving in quality. And you say, well, how can that be? It can only be if the deer are eating something besides the native habitat. And in this case, we had a high percentage, about 10 or 12% of very productive food plots. We had no farm crops, but we had food plots for the deer. And so what happened, the deer were spending so much of their time feeding in the food plots, they literally were allowing the woods to recover from a state where they had been with even a lower number of deer, but no food plots. So that's kind of a convoluted way of saying if you have enough food, you can have a super high number of deer, and those deer are going to be healthy, so they're probably less susceptible to disease anyway. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get bovine TB or, even EHD or whatever, because those things do still happen. But I think the individual animal's chances of surviving it, and many of them do survive EHD, especially in farm country where the deer are very healthy to start with. In many cases, that does not kill the deer. They just get over it and develop some resistance to it. So I think sometimes we put too much worry, if you will, into the idea, we've got too many deer. Well, let's reverse that and say, no, we don't have too many deer. We have too little for the deer to eat. And that is something we potentially can control with the right management practices.
Kind of reminds me of the industrial age and how we figured out how to farm correctly and provide plenty of food for everybody in the United States and around the world. Now we have an obesity problem kind of thing. That's interesting. So hardy food plots could be an answer in some of these scenarios so that they don't eat native vegetation.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I heard somebody the other day say they're talking about this really big deer that was actually a set of sheds found back in the Midwest in the late 1950s. And of course, many places then had only had deer seasons for a few years. And in fact, this particular area, I think, had just literally had 1 or 2 years of deer hunting in the modern era after they restocked their herd. And the guy was saying, boy, isn't it great, have a deer that big back in the days when there wasn't any management or any food plots or anything like that. And I got to thinking, well, yeah, I get what you're saying. However, I know where that set of antlers came from, and that county that produced that deer was at that time the largest alfalfa production county in that state, and much of it was already under irrigation. So you talk about maybe one of the world's greatest food plots was right there, but nobody called it a food plot. So we tend not to think of that as deer management. We tend to think of that as just some byproduct, if you will, intentionally of farming practices. But that's basically what the Midwest and parts, the rest of the country have become, is giant, super productive food plots. And the deer utilizing that are not living really on native habitat very much. I mean, because if you go back to Illinois or Iowa in the 1850s, let's say, just go back 150 years, then really you're talking you're talking about a sea of prairie grass, very little tree cover, quote, virgin conditions, but there were not a lot of plants there for deer to survive well on. And thus the deer densities were not that high in that part of the world compared to what they are now, with everything being a food plot. So even what we call native versus, or natural versus man-made habitats, our own perspective on it is maybe different from nature's.
Right. It's fascinating. So when you're looking at this stuff, I mean, you're not just looking at big deer being taken in certain scenarios. It's not, I mean, you're digging into food plots, agriculture. You're looking at how the agriculture gets a source of water and nutrients. I mean, there's a lot more that goes into this. And you've got a historical basis of all this stuff.
Yeah, it is interesting. People, I guess we all tend to think about the, quote, good old days and say, man, what would it have been like to be a whitetail hunter back even 100 years ago? Mm-hmm. Well, 100 years ago, there weren't many deer. We know that. Even in the places that still had deer, they didn't have many. Many places had none. And yet, if you look at it and say, well, some of the very biggest deer of all time in the record books, let's say the Jordan buck from northwestern Wisconsin, 1914. Mm-hmm. You go 4 years later into northern Minnesota, the Breen buck, both of those world record typicals, 1940, northeastern Ohio, the hole in the horn found dead. Still, some of the very biggest bucks in the record book came from back in those days with very few deer. Now, that, again, we know that low deer densities and big deer and top-end deer tend to go together. That's historically been kind of a correlation there. But we also know that today, there's been more 300-inch bucks by far killed since early 2000s than there were in all of history before then that we can actually document. I won't say that there weren't giants killed by, the Iroquois in 1811 or whatever, but I don't know that. But right. I do know that if we just look at what we can document, the earliest Boone and Crockett being 1830 in northwestern Pennsylvania, killed by a guy named Arthur Young. That's the earliest of any species of Boone and Crockett animal in any record book, is that buck from northwestern PA. And that's still one of the bigger deer ever killed in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, not a great trophy state, but back in those days, it's fascinating that one of the greatest bucks was killed supposedly in 1830. And so, but a time with probably very few deer, there probably were still wolves around for all I know, and certainly bears and a lot of other natural predators, and a few hunters out on the frontier area, if you will, that were killing some deer. And there were some big deer back then. Again, the Breen buck, the Jordan, the hole in the horn. We know these were deer that lived in very low density areas. But yet we come to today and we look and say, well, gee, since 2000, we've had 5 netting over 300 inches, all killed by hunters in various places. No states produce 2 of them, but we've had a relative surge in these really big deer. And you say, well, how could that be? Because we have more deer now. We have all this other stuff going on that would theoretically diminish the top end. Well, the top end could still be great if you got enough food and you've got enough age on those deer, and obviously genetically you have the right deer. But I think it's interesting to look at that surge, if you will. I'm not saying there's been an overall surge in the number of big deer since 2000, but the very biggest top-end deer, the giant 300-inch non-typicals, there has been a surge in those deer, and that's pretty fascinating.
So there's been a surge in the non-typical big deer.
Yes.
And more of those numbers. Record-breaking 300-inch deer, are they actually becoming the top end, or are they're just more of close records?
Well, if we look back at what's the highest gross score ever, total antler on a wild whitetail that we know of, and that is the hole in the horn. I think it's around 342 or 3 inches gross score. Again, 1940 northeastern Ohio, which is not an area really well known for giant non-typicals, but right. He is the largest of all of them, including bigger than the Missouri Monarch when it comes to gross score. So if you look at that deer, then you say, well, okay, that one kind of goes back, about 80 years almost now, but we have seen these other bucks Again, the Lovestone buck out of Iowa, 307. The Jerry Bryant crossbow buck out of Illinois, that's back in 2001. Well, that deer was 304. He's the world record with the crossbow. Since then, you've had the Amish buck. You've had some of these other deer, the Tembec buck, shotgun buck out of north central Indiana. Again, not an area known for big deer, but a 305 non-typical with the biggest typical frame of all time. And that deer just kind of fell out of the sky there in the Midwest, and Tim shot him, and it's a great buck, And so those deer, and then of course you had that Stephen Tucker 312 out of northern Tennessee of all places in 2016, muzzleloader buck.
Yep.
That was, while not an exceptionally massive deer, he has tremendous number of long points, and you can't get to 312 in any cheap way. I mean, you're a giant when you score 312, and he netted 312. And so that, again, an unlikely deer, maybe from an unlikely place, but for whatever reason, we've suddenly had this flurry of them. And then of course, this last fall, we had the Luke Brewster buck, vertical bow kill out of Illinois, which was beat all of them at 327 and 7/8. I mean, he's the biggest hunter kill deer of all time. And so this trend, it literally started around the turn of this latest century, has literally continued right up through the 2018 season in terms of top-end deer. Now, again, I don't know that we can necessarily say it's that way for typicals. Milo Handsome from 1993, of course, is still easily the world record typical. We haven't had a bunch of 200s killed since then on the typical side, but there have been a lot of big deer. But it's mostly the non-typical category that really seems to have been impacted here in the last 15 or 20 years.
Isn't that interesting? It's fascinating to think that we're having 300 conversations, or conversations about 300-inch deer routinely, or far more so than we really have ever, I guess, right?
Well, there's 7 of them all time that are intact racks. I think we just basically mentioned all of them at one time or another in that last few minutes. There's 7 of them. There's 7 of them. The only 2 that are prior to the year 2000 would be the Hole in the Horn out of Ohio in 1940, 328 and 2/8 net, and then you had 333 and 7/8 net, which was the Missouri Monarch, found dead just north of St. Louis in 1981. And so those 2 300s were just, again, the 1940 buck had been out there a long time. We just didn't know it until the 1980s. He was never measured until then. So there were 300s that go back, 79 years now at least, that we know of, but there were only 2 of them prior to 2000. And so then you had, Mike Beatty's buck from Ohio and killed in 2000 with a vertical bow. Well, that's still the P&Y world record at 294 and 0/8. However, he's in the Buckeye Big Buck Club record book at his original entry score, which is 304 and 6/8. Now, so he's arguably the first 300-inch deer killed by a hunter, and that was in 2000. Regardless of his net score, he does gross well over 300. So if we just look at gross 300-inch deer, they've pretty much almost all been in this new century or new millennium, if you will.
Right.
There were a couple of sets of sheds. The Minnesota Monarch, 334 estimated score, early 90s, late 80s, up in northern Minnesota. That deer was never killed, and he's the world record set of sheds, and he would be right there with the Missouri Monarch if he'd been killed that year, but he wasn't. And so he's this other 300-inch deer known from a set of sheds, as well as the Jim Bass sheds out of northeastern Kansas in the 1980s, I believe. Roughly 307 net, non-typical. If you put the antlers together and give him an estimated spread, he was easily over 300. But there's only those 2 deer known by sheds, even, that were over 300 net. And then again, 7 of them total, and 5 of the total were all of them put together. Only 5 of them were killed by hunters, but every one of them is killed in 2001 or later. So you ask yourself, well, what's going on with that? Is that just a product of more management or age? But some of these deer were not even really known until they were shot,
Yeah.
And even the Brewster buck from last year was not anywhere near that size at age 6.5, but he suddenly just blew up at 7.5 and became easily the greatest hunter kill whitetail of all time. And so maybe these kind of deer have been out there all along, but because they're not reaching that one magical year, we never knew what their potential really was. And that would certainly be true of the Brewster buck had he been shot prior to last season.
Gotcha. So perhaps it's a management thing where there's a collective amongst hunters that letting the bucks age more and getting more of these deer to this magical year, that perhaps that's why we're seeing this now, where in years past that wasn't necessarily the case. You'd get the occasional one, but never would you see this many, and that the sentiment of letting deer grow was not prevalent back in the 40s, 30s, 20s.
Well, that's entirely true, and there's another factor involved here that is kind of fascinating. And the Europeans, I believe the Germans, tapped into this roughly 400 years ago. The old gamekeepers who were dealing with red deer back then, they realized that if you had deer that were habitually malnourished, they would, over several generations, just become smaller animals. And we have seen that in places like, with whitetail, like places like the Texas Hill Country. And you see it in island populations in many cases with various kinds of animals where, because of overcrowding, lack of food, it's not at a lethal threshold where all the deer die off, but it's just down to a point where all the deer just barely get by. And because of that, their frames are smaller, their body mass is smaller, their antler size is smaller in the case of deer, and they just become stunted, if you will. We've certainly seen this in the Texas Hill Country where 100 years ago you had giant bucks, but not very many deer. And then the habitat was changed by sheep and goats and a lot of vegetation changes brought about by clearing land. And then the number of deer went sky high, but the number of great big deer dropped to the bottom. And so it just became a function of not enough food. Now, what's interesting about this, and I've talked to a friend of mine that showed it on his own ranch in Texas because he had one of those stunted populations. And they had no food plots, they had no supplemental feed, they really were just a native aboriginal herd that was just trying to kind of get by in a difficult environment. Now, he came in and started planting very drought-tolerant food plot plant, and it is a legume, and it's very nutritious, and it will handle dry weather. So he started planting this, and he noticed that within 3 generations of deer, his deer body size went up by about 20%, if not more. And that included the fawns were born at a bigger size than they were 10 years earlier. The does were bigger than they were 10 years earlier. And the buck's not only body size, but antler size suddenly reverted to its genetic potential for, age for age. So he was suddenly getting on a ranch. In fact, the first year he put food plots in, he said he had a known buck that was already fully mature that scored about 140. That year, they killed that buck after 6 months on food plots. The deer was in the 170s. Now, I'm not saying that happens all the time, and this is not some thinly veiled sort of a commercial for food plots here. I'm just saying that if your deer are habitually stunted, and you can even see it with the human population. Look how much bigger people are today than they were 100 years ago.
Right,
I mean, it is as nutrition. I don't just mean horizontally. I just mean taller, just bigger people. And so what's happened as the food supply has improved, and generation for generation, the deer have just become better fed, literally from in the womb until they die of old age. At some point, about the 3rd generation of those deer, generation time on whitetails is 3.5 years. That's just how it's considered to be by biologists. Obviously, deer don't have to be 3.5 to breed, but that is generation time in the whitetail population from a biological perspective.
Right.
And so the 3rd generation of deer, which takes you to about a decade, if those deer have always been on great food since before they were born, they, by about the 10-year threshold, they suddenly kind of explode into what nature really intended them to be, and that is much bigger framed, much bigger bodied, and potentially much bigger antlered deer with much greater mass and everything else. Now, that's an example coming at you from Texas. Now, people say, well, we're not in Texas, that doesn't apply to us, but it could apply easily to what we're seeing with some of the food plots and farming practices in the Midwest. Because what happened at one time was that people were saying, well, the deer just live off the farm crops, and we got big deer because we have corn and beans. But part of the year, you don't have that food. Part of the year, those deer are struggling to get by in the winter, especially a winter like this. A lot of places lost deer this year. But think how many they would have lost had they not had any cool season food plots like we now have.
Right.
A lot of people in the last 20 years have started planting cool season plots for deer. And I do think that has helped them get over the bad spots of the winter and come into spring in better shape. And over, whether it's bucks or does, they're just going to be more productive and bigger animals in better condition. And that has got to lead to a statistical improvement in the odds of growing these super bucks.
Right.
Now,
right.
Why we've only seen it on the non-typical side and not so much typical, I have no idea. But I do think generational stunning and the reversal of generational stunning has clearly been an impact because, again, the Germans saw it 400 years ago. The stunning that they saw over time with lack of nutrition, they realized that with proper nutrition, they could reverse it. And again, even in red deer, it took about 3 generations to see it. But once they saw it, it was a, quote, permanent cure as long as the food was still there.
Right.
But when food goes away, the deer size drops off again. So does that have something to explain? Does that somehow explain what's going on in the Midwest or in parts of Canada with seeing these really big top-end deer? I can't say that for sure, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, interesting observation in theory, of course, but still, there's something to it. I mean, I relate this back to just humans, right? Industrial revolution. You've got 3 or 4 generations since an industrial revolution of humans that have, I don't know if you've seen this, but when I walk into a gymnasium these days, it seems like all the high school kids are about a foot taller than anything I ever remembered playing in high school.
Exactly. I mean, and it's true, really. I mean, it's not, you could say, well, it's selective breeding or whatever. No, it's not selective breeding in humans any more than probably it ever was.
Right.
But they just have a stronger foundation. I don't even know about birth weights in humans. Perhaps they've gone up over the years. I don't know that, but I do know that kids in high school, this seem like they're bigger. I mean, people are just bigger than they used to be.
It just seems that way. Yeah. So maybe there is this evidence that it's just a biological thing, and it sounds like you've got some other information from Europe that suggests all that. That's very, very interesting. But yeah, why the non-typicals? Why not the typicals? That's interesting dilemma there too.
Well, there is one thing to be said about it, and I know my friend Dr. Kroll, they call him Dr. Deer for a reason, and because I think he knows more about deer than anybody else does. But he tells me that he says if you see a deer that's extremely smooth on its antler basis and it doesn't have any really much beating at all, it's just very slick antlers, he said, generally speaking, that deer has not been under ideal nutritional condition. He said that what will happen is you see these deer that have got really, and deer differ genetically, I realize that, just as they do with height and everything else in people. But he says, in general, if you see a lot of deer in an area with a lot of heavy beating on their antlers and a lot of abnormal points, a lot of times those might not fully develop if the deer is under nutritional stress. He may have the genetics for all those drop tines and sticker points and burr points and fork brow tines and all these things, but because of his genetics would allow it, but the nutritional level throughout his lifespan will not. And so he doesn't really express all that stuff to the extent he would if he were on great nutrition. So that may well tie back into what we're talking about, that those deer that suddenly just start blowing off all those extra points, that is a product, conceivably at least, of better nutritional levels throughout their lifespan, that suddenly it all comes together at one magical year and they just really blow up. At least that's, it fits with the theory we're talking about.
It does. What are some of the hot spots that you're looking at when you're trying to decide where the next big buck is going to come from? Are there certain states that are more focal than others?
Well, you look at the record book, Jay, and I'm a believer that history tends to tell you what to expect to happen next, and in many ways, but that's certainly the case with That's certainly the case with something like a planning a record book hunt, if you will. Nobody can really plan, in my opinion, to say, well, I'm going to go here because this is where a world record came from, or this is where this number of big deer came from, and so I'm just going to go there and kill mine. Well, if it were that easy, we'd all go to western Saskatchewan, we go to southern Iowa, we go to wherever, and we go shopping for him, and we get him and bring him home, right? I mean, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
However, if you say that I would just want to play the odds, what I'm doing here is I'm just saying the places that have produced the very biggest deer are likely to give me a chance to produce to shoot a really nice deer, even if I don't see one of those all-time record book bucks. There must be something here that leads to big deer. And so I guess all of us probably sit back and look and say, well, where did this deer come from? And where's that buck? Where's that set of sheds from or whatever? And then you kind of fantasize about, man, if I went there, maybe I'd see that deer or that kind of deer. And so you look at it and you say, well, okay, I'm a bow hunter. Let's say, so I don't care anything about where I could go shoot one with a gun, but so maybe I don't really want to go to Canada. The bow hunting in Canada is really tough. The weather's nasty. There aren't many deer, but the Midwest really, southwestern Ohio. I mean, there must be some reason they come from southwestern Ohio, because there's so many of the elite deer have come from that general part of that one state. Same way with southern Iowa. It's just hard to get a tag in Iowa, and of course Ohio's over the counter. So, but both of them are tremendous places for killing these really big deer, and I don't see how that's going to change anytime soon. I mean, it's been that way for a while. I don't suddenly see another state, South Dakota or somewhere like that. It's not suddenly going to come online as the next hotspot, in my opinion, because we've now got so many years of track record on these states that we can kind of see what it is they seem to produce. So that, you may say, well, my state doesn't show up very well in the record book, so maybe I need to quit hunting here. Well, that's not to say that, you need to hunt where you're having fun hunting and where you have a chance to hunt, because that's what deer hunting is really all about. However, if you say my life goal, my bucket list item is I need to kill a deer that nets 170 typical, I can stay here in Georgia the rest of my life, and maybe I'll kill one. I don't think I will. The odds are just not good. And they're not great anywhere, but they're way better in Ohio or Iowa or Illinois or Kansas or Saskatchewan than they are here. So, some of us have just said, look, maybe not for all our hunting, but for some of our hunting, we would really like to go on that occasional trip where we just feel like, hey, if I see a deer coming, it's got a chance at least to be the greatest deer of my life.
Right.
And some places, if you fish in a pond without any big bass in it, you won't catch one.
That's right.
I mean, you're just going to have to go where they are. So I do think there's a certain number of people now that are kind of into that are chasing around looking for that, for that end of the rainbow, if you will. And once in a while, a guy finds it. But, a misconception, I think, is that if you go to these places that produce these giant bucks, that they're going to be standing around waiting for you like on a postcard or something. And it's just not that way. Big deer they just don't want to die, you know?
Right.
And so I think a lot of people trump it up in their head that, oh, well, if I could ever get there, it would just be this magical, land of the dinosaurs or whatever. And it's still hard to kill big deer. I don't care where you go. It's just, but you have no chance if they're not there. So you have to go to a place that has the potential, and beyond there, it's still deer hunting.
Let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off with Gordon Whittington.
Rackology Deer Supplement and Attractant, developed through years of intense scientific research, comes a product that puts it all in one bag. Superior attractant, scientifically formulated vitamins and minerals, and all at a much better price. To get yours today, please check out rackology.org for a list of dealers. Rackology, how can you afford not to use it? Everything deer need, all in one bag.
And now back to our conversation with Gordon Whittington from North American Whitetail. I've heard some amazing stories about the integrity of these giant bucks. I mean, a bow and arrow, even well placed, it's almost like they have plate armor in a sense. You can shoot them, you can do pass through shots. They live, they keep going. They're just so amazingly geared towards survival that it'll frustrate the best of the best.
It really does, and they have this innate, in their case, I guess it's totally unconscious ability to totally psych us out when we're hunting them. And it's fascinating, that Brewster buck we were talking about from last year in Illinois. Luke Brewster told me, he said when the deer walked out, he was so big, and again, nearly 340 gross inches of antler. He said, I'm sitting there with my bow, and he said, I'm thinking, like, if I shoot him, is it going to bounce off?
Right.
He said, I literally thought, and he killed deer before with a bow. He's a hunter. I mean, he's a Marine, been to Afghanistan. I mean, he knows his way around, and yet he was thinking, this seems so insufficient and inadequate for me to even think I can kill that thing sitting here with a stick. And yet he's sitting there with a $1,500 carbon bow and state-of-the-art equipment, and he made a great shot, and he killed the deer. But it psyched him out almost to the point where he thought, I don't even know if I should shoot at that thing.
Right.
And yet, obviously, that's what he was there for, was to try to shoot a deer. But he just said the sight of something that big and that impressive is just like, it makes you feel small, and deer do that even when they don't know we're there. Big deer have that ability to just totally freak you out, and they don't even necessarily know that you're anywhere within a mile of them.
Yeah.
Yet they're just such impressive animals.
I've heard stories of the big animals, the Southwest Ohio buck kind of things, where it's almost like you don't have enough weapon in some ways. And these are stories coming from, game officers that are helping people track bucks that, like, you don't understand. These bucks will go forever. They'll heal. They'll be shot multiple times. They'll be passed through shots in the zone that you thought was the kill zone, and they just don't die. You've got to really figure out and get lucky in some senses, because they're so strong and so driven to live that they will find a way.
Yeah, especially during the rut when a big buck is really already revved up, a lot of adrenaline, a lot of testosterone. He's really been, for all you know, 30 minutes before you shot at him, he was in some mortal combat with a deer his own size, and they were breaking over trees and just having this epic battle. And so he's already a finely tuned physical, machine, if you will.
Yeah.
And for us to think sometimes that, all I got to do is get an arrow into one lung and he can't go far. Well, believe me, some deer live on one lung. They live years on one lung, and they just, especially if you go high and back and catch the corner of one lung, and sometimes even a little bit of the liver and one lung, I've seen deer just go and go and go, even though they weren't being pushed. They just went just forever, sometimes lived over a day, and finally just succumbed. But, I mean, a deer can go a long way in a day, and I'm convinced a lot of deer that are, quote, shot well are shot almost well. And had they been shot an inch or two one way or the other, they would have caught maybe that second lung, maybe caught a little bit more of the main part of an organ, and really would have died within 15 seconds. But as it was, they just went on and maybe literally lived another 3 or 4 years. I've seen deer. I broke off 13 inches of aluminum arrow in a buck's chest one time, and a day later, that buck was chasing does a half mile from there. Yep. Because I shot under the heart through the brisket, and he literally died of old age 3 years later.
Yep. I've encountered deer that I knew a deer had gotten shot, and I went in trying to find that deer the next day, and lo and behold, I caught this deer on a scrape. Thing had, should have been dead, but there he is, scraping and rutting, and gave me just a brief glimpse of him. Did not expect to see him on his feet. And in a way, he went like he'd never been hit before. And that was 24 hours after he'd been shot with a rifle. I mean, it's astonishing.
It's just amazing. There was one of the greatest bucks ever shot in the Cincinnati area. A high school boy shot him many years ago. The deer had like 17-inch tines. He's a colossal, typical buck. The guy was in a tree stand, sitting there with his bow. The deer comes in to work a scrape. The guy shoots him. The deer hops out away from there, looks around, makes a circle comes back and starts working the scrape again. The deer's already dead on his feet. He doesn't even know it, and then the deer falls over.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so their mindset, if you will, mentality, whatever you want to call it, it is they're rugged animals, and we look at them and say, well, by big game standards, they have thin skin, light bone structure. They're not a rhino. They're not a Cape buffalo. No, but they have a tremendous will to live, and they are a finely tuned machine.
They really are. It's fascinating. Let's talk about the Brewster buck. We kind of talked about the season last year, how it went, some forecasts, some theories of why things are happening. But the highlight of last year, and you covered this in North American Whitetail, the story of the Brewster buck. And I'd like to kind of hear more about that for those that haven't picked up the latest issue yet. I think this would be a good place to start.
Well, it is to start with. I only have great things to say about the deer and the hunter both. I mean, it's always our hope here at North American Whitetail, and I'm sure I speak for the rest of the hunting media when I say this. You always hope that special animal that's going to get a lot of play and public attention and notoriety, you always hope that animal is taken by somebody that's totally on the up and up, that is a great ambassador of what we do. And I can absolutely say that not only is the Brewster buck special, he obviously is, but Luke is as well. Luke's an extremely low-key guy. He's only 30 years old. He lives in about an hour west of D.C. in Northern Virginia, but he went back to hunt family land last November with his buddies in eastern Illinois, Edgar County. And this buck that they had on camera, this buck comes by, it comes into him at 26 yards working a scrape, and Luke shoots him, and 50 yards later he tips over, and we have easily the greatest hunter-taken whitetail of all time. Again, 327 and 7/8 net non-typical, which puts him only 3/8 of an inch behind the hole in the horn, which is, so he's now a new number 3 all-time wild whitetail, period, and easily the biggest one by hunting, because the 312 Stephen Tucker buck from Tennessee 2 years prior had been, of course, the hunter-taken world record before then. And everybody was saying, well, nobody's going to break 312. Well, literally 2 years later, just under 2 years to the day, a guy with a vertical bow kills a 327 and 7/8. And so you say, well, what is the limit? Well, who knows what the limit is now, because that's kind of redefined in our minds, what could be shot by a hunter. But I will say this, that Luke, just a very low-key, super nice guy. He's is in the Marines twice to Afghanistan.
Wow.
Once more as a defense contractor. Now works for the power company, and his wife had a baby a month after he shoots this monster buck and their first child, and life is good. But he's just such a pleasant, regular, good guy that he's the kind of guy that we all hope is going to shoot a buck like that, because he's just, no rumors, no high fence, no nothing about this deer. No, the game warden came out literally the day after he shot it and went with him to the place where he shot it and looked at the deer. So everything got the blessing of the DNR. No controversy about scoring the deer. He obviously is as big as advertised. In fact, his left antler is almost 200 inches by itself.
Wow.
Which makes it the single biggest wild whitetail antler of all time, shed or otherwise, and it's not even close. The right side of the Minnesota Monarch scored 180 and 0.8. That was a set of sheds, of course.
Right.
And that's previously the biggest single whitetail antler of all time in the wild. This deer is clearly bigger than that on his left side. And so, when your weak side scores almost 120, that's a pretty good buck, Jay.
Yeah, it is. That's your weak
it's
point,
a nice,
right?
Yeah, my weak side is the 120. So, but anyway, and here's the thing about the deer: he's unique to look at. He's got all these huge points on his left side. He really made a spectacular cover for our spring issue, and that's still the only place anybody can read the actual full hunting story is in that spring issue that's out there right now.
Yeah.
Be out there for a few more weeks, but it's really just fascinating to talk to a guy like Luke and to see he wanted to shoot the deer. He knew the deer was there. His buddies were all hunting it, but it's the first time he'd ever seen it in daylight. And the deer had been on that property off and on for several years, and they had until that morning he shot it, they had never had a daylight photograph of that deer on any trail camera. And the morning he shot it, there was a photograph of the deer about 8 o'clock in the morning, about a half mile away, walking in front of the camera. Clearly the same buck, walking down a field edge. That afternoon, half mile away, he shot it in the timber. And so the deer was obviously becoming more active, but the deer was 7.5 when he shot him. And you say, well, that's kind of odd for a deer of that age to suddenly become more active in daytime.
Right.
But sometimes these really old bucks actually do that. They get a little bit past their breeding prime and they become a little either careless or, we'll call it lazy, but they just become a little less attuned to danger. And this deer walked in well before dark and started working this scrape. And Luke had literally just walked in on the trail that this deer crossed. And the deer never smelled him or anything. He went to that scrape and he held it together and made a 26-yard shot. And the deer only went about 50 yards. But between the time he shot him and the time he got to where he fell dead, he broke off 2 major points hitting against a tree.
Oh, wow. Well,
Luke saw that it was freshly broken on the rack, and he didn't know anything about the rack really beyond just the fact it was points going everywhere. But so he backtracked, and he had walked past those 2 antlers lying at the base of that tree as he followed the blood trail. They stuck them back on there. Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young both agreed that they would allow him to put the points back on, and there was about 20 inches of total points that were broken off with that one piece that broke. So that's that amount of antler that he found at the base of the tree literally took him to 327 7/8, and easily the number 1 whitetail of all time taken by a hunter with any weapon.
Wow.
So some things, Jay, you just really can't make up. And in this case, the truth is stranger than fiction, but it's just a special, special deer. I've had him in my hands. I've interviewed Luke. I've taken photographs with him. Everything about this guy is the real deal. Everything about the deer is the real deal. And I don't expect to see a bigger hunter-taken whitetail, or frankly, any wild whitetail even found dead in what's left of my whitetail career. But if that's as big as they get in my turn in the industry, then I'll be quite happy, because it's a special animal and a special guy.
Wow. What a story, huh? I mean, to think that much antler broke off. Some guys will shoot, bucks that have just what broke off. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a magnificent animal. I mean, there's no other deer that looks like this deer to start with. There's no other deer that has a left antler like this one at all, and that includes the biggest of the big that have ever been known through sheds or anything else.
Right.
He's just a super colossal animal. And again, coming out of eastern Illinois, not a county really that had been that well known for giant deer. Edgar County had 1 260 killed years ago, which is a great buck, but not nearly as big as this.
Yeah.
But realistically, eastern Illinois, genetics, habitat, general management with a short shotgun season, it's just one of those places that every so often is going to throw out a mega giant. And this now makes Illinois, a couple interesting facts, this now makes Illinois the first state to ever have 2 absolute documented, button down 300-inch net whitetails. It is the only state to have done that. Now, also, this now gives Illinois the all-time typical and non-typical record with a vertical bow, the world records. No state has ever simultaneously held both of those records. And so for all the people that say, well, I wish I could hunt Iowa, I wish I could go to Alberta, I wish I could go to Kansas, you're traveling through the one state that's produced more 300s than they have.
Right.
So
I want to think about that for a sec. Right.
Yeah, as you're driving through those cornfields in Illinois trying to get to Iowa, well, just think about the fact that, as great as Iowa is, it's never had 2 net, documented 300-inch non-typicals, and Kansas hasn't either. And so nor Missouri, nor Nebraska, wherever. So there is something special going on in Illinois, even though many people would say, well, the heyday of Illinois is past. It's not like it used to be 25 years ago and everybody wanted to go to Illinois. But it just goes to show that if you let a deer get old enough in that habitat and some of the best, most fertile soil on earth, he has a chance to express something special, and this deer obviously did.
Yeah. Easily overlooked. And statistics they can lie depending on who's doing the study. But these aren't manipulated statistics. It's just facts. That as you stated, crazy. That's
and the thing is, if this deer had actually migrated about half a county east and been shot, then Indiana would be the state claiming to have 200-300s.
Right.
Instead of Illinois, it's one of those border bucks that could have gone either way. But he lived well onto the Illinois side of the line there. But it wasn't, as the crow flies, as they say, not terribly far from Indiana.
Right.
So, and a lot of people just overlook Indiana as having that kind of potential. But when a deer gets old in Indiana, he's got a chance to be special.
Right. Fascinating. How far was the hunter traveling to hunt this buck? Was it kind of nearby, or did he have to plan out?
Well, like I say, he literally drove his truck from where he lives near Washington, D.C. He drove it all the way to eastern Illinois, and then got a few hours of sleep and then went hunting.
Wow.
And so, he had a family connection to the land he was hunting.
Okay.
But they're just small farms, and he and his buddies all kind of hunt together, and his buddies all live out there. But so they were all aware of the buck. They were all running trail cameras. But the thing in Illinois that's interesting is with trail cameras, we tend to think, well, just put out some mineral, put out some bait or whatever, and you can get pictures of bucks. Well, in Illinois, you can't use mineral. You can't use bait even outside the deer season. So the only place they could really put their trail cameras was on natural scrapes along the field edges. And so that's the only place. They weren't going into the timber really to try to photograph deer. They were just catching them on scrapes on the field edges. And that's part of why this deer probably, and other bucks there, were mostly being photographed at night, because they were on field edge scrapes is where the cameras were.
Gotcha. Had
he been able to run mineral or something back in the timber, then maybe they'd have been getting daylight photos. But that is one of the burdens that the Illinois guys have to deal with, is the fact that they can't doctor up a spot or put out a corn feed or anything like that for deer, because the state's the laws are such that they can't do it. So he had to overcome that challenge as well. But nonetheless, they still got multiple photographs of this deer. It's just all of them were at night except for the morning he shot the buck, and that was on November 2nd.
Gotcha. So he's driving 9 hours or so, maybe 10 hours to get to the spot from where he lives and hunting land that he would once knew. It's not, and that area, not that Illinois and Virginia are necessarily related, but there's good deer hunting in Virginia, probably not big bucks but like that, but certainly go across the bay there into Maryland, there are big deer there too. So kind of fascinating. Virginia
is a good deer state. It really is kind of a sleeper, actually. And Luke hunts around Virginia, but he mostly hunted on public land, and he really hadn't shot anything noteworthy before, but he certainly has now.
Very, very interesting story. So were there any other kind of runner-ups that you can think of that might have stuck out, or is this is the king?
Well, we had a deer grossed a little over 250 shot by a woman up in Alberta last year.
Okay.
And that might be the all-time women's record for Alberta. The deer grossed in the 250s. I think he's going to net in the high 230s. But he certainly looks like a 250. He's really a big deer. He had some bucks like that were shot. We had a few. Indiana had a really big 250-something gross, 230-something net crossbow buck shot in southern Indiana by a guy that was in his 70s. And really another one of those great stories to be in the magazine this summer. But we had some bucks like that, but we didn't have any other high 200s or 300-inch non-typicals. The Brewster buck clearly just dominated in that regard. And even the big typicals, I've seen Wisconsin has a new typical archery record, low 190s, that was shot last year. That Wisconsin's got more Pope and Young deer in the record book than any other state. So when you shoot the number one in Wisconsin, it takes a pretty good buck. This deer's like 192, and so he's another great one to feature in North American Whitetail. But there were a few deer scattered here and there that were like that, but basically it was just one of those years where a lot of people shot good deer and saw good activity and had good results in the field, and just I think we're feeling that, hey, things are trending upward again. And so I can't wait to see what 2019 brings, because 2018 was hit a pretty sweet note.
Any predictions for 2019?
I predict there will be a deer season.
All right, that's solid.
I think
solid.
we can count on that part, I believe,
Yeah.
and I predict about 10 million of us will be out there participating in it. And beyond there, I've had people ask me, say, well, what are your own plans for this year? And I told somebody the other day, I said, look, I have one place that I know I will be this fall. That on the afternoon of December the 3rd, late that afternoon, will be 50 years to the hour after I shot what I still consider my most special buck. And that's when I was 13, living there on the ranch in Texas. And I found this buck in late October, and I hunted him. I found him by myself. I hunted him by myself, and I killed him by myself on the afternoon of December 3rd. And I still consider he's a 120-something inch 11-pointer, but I still consider him my greatest trophy buck, because he was the first one I shot by myself, and he was the biggest deer I'd ever seen on the ranch at that time. And to me, that was a really special achievement, and I was very proud of that, and I still am. But I said I've never hunted that spot since then. We still have that live oak is still standing on that same ridge in our pasture in Texas. And I said, the one thing I can promise is that I'm still breathing on December the 3rd. That afternoon, I will be sitting under that tree, and I will be holding the same gun I shot that deer with. It's an old Model 742 6mm Remington.
Yep.
That I was using. A ton of people, especially in the Northeast, have still got those semi-autos, But mine's in 6mm. And that's what I was using. We still have it in the family. I'm going to break it out of the gun case. I'm going to shoot it a couple of times, make sure it's still on, and I'm going to go sit under that tree on December the 3rd that afternoon. And if I kill a big buck or don't see an armadillo, it's all going to be the same to me, because I'm going to relive that hunt in my mind 50 years to the hour after it happened. And I just have told myself for years that if I make it that far, I'm going to do that. And that's the one thing I can promise about the 2019 season. If I'm still around, I'm going to be under that tree.
Right.
And we'll see what happens. It's not even going to be filmed. I'm just going to go sit under the tree and reminisce. But
that's awesome.
That will make it a good season, even if I don't see an ant, So I just feel like that's something I just want to do. But I hope everybody has a great season. I do think we're set up for another really, really good year. If we don't have bad EHD in the Midwest this year or up into the Great Lakes, I think we're just going to see a continuation of this rebound that we're on. And I do believe a lot of really big deer are going to get shot.
Yep, I agree. I've been seeing it grow year over year. Even in my own state that's not known for deer at all. You just notice trends, right? They're seeing better and better deer coming out of New Hampshire. If you look at some of the whitetail reports and talk to some of the biologists, 2 years ago, they set the record all time for most mature bucks killed in 1 year. And then
that's awesome.
And then last year was even better. So it broke its own record 1 year later. So there are trends that are occurring across the country.
Well, there is one thing we can say is that as the downside of an aging hunter population, as we both know, Jay, is that we are not getting the hunter recruitment we would like to see to follow in our footsteps. I mean, that's just society has just got a lot of obstacles to that happening. However, the upside of it is that the average person out there now is more mature, more selective, and I believe hunting more for just the pure enjoyment of it, whether it's related to family or just it may still have a special goal of taking his best buck or whatever, but But I just don't think people are just randomly shooting up the woods the way they did 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Just like, oh, there's a deer, just start shooting. Well, there's not as much of that anymore, and that's a good thing.
Yep. And I'll throw one more trend at you. Maybe you can have some reflection on this too. I've seen a trend, both subjectively and from what I'm reading is statistical, is that seems to be a growing population of adult hunters coming into the hunting world that I haven't seen before. I've personally taken 3 brand new 40-plus hunters into the woods over the last 3 years, and they've gotten their license. That's crazy.
That's great, and really, it is an overall trend that we are seeing. People, you look at it in social media and whatnot, you tend to see it. There's a ton more women, females of all ages, that are getting involved in it, and that is absolutely fantastic. We love that, because that we need women in the woods just like we need men in the woods.
Right.
But yet we also need these people that did not grow up in traditional, male-oriented rural households or family circles that were just attuned and always hunted. Grandpa hunted, uncles hunted, everybody hunted, all your friends hunted, everybody let out of school to go hunting, and those days are becoming, those scenarios are becoming harder to find now. And the rise of single parent households, especially headed by women, a lot of these things work against the traditional male mentored rural activities. We know that.
Right.
But there are a ton of people now that are intrigued by it and are saying, look, that sounds like a healthy food. Venison sounds healthy, and it's something I want to try.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to get closer to my food supply. The whole locavore movement, if you will, is not just a term. I mean, it's real. It's going on out there, and particularly as the more urban-oriented population starts to see nature as a food supply and not just someplace to go on family vacation to the park, but to actually see that as part of the ecosystem that they're part of, or that they want to be part of, that absolutely can help hunting.
Yep.
There's no question about that, and we have plenty of deer. We're not short on deer, and the more of them can be put to good use, like you say, through new hunters or established hunters, either one. That's all very positive, and I certainly applaud you and anybody else who's out there recruiting people like that, because they also can then turn into recruiters themselves if they really get into it, and thus our numbers can expand that way. That's not a traditional source of new hunters, but it absolutely is a potential source these days.
Right. Yeah, and you nailed it. In every case that I've been involved with, they were interested in finding their own meat and understanding where their meat came from, and a more traditional sense, so that they could, and in tradition, I mean going pre-supermarket tradition, where they would understand that the whole process and have a higher respect for the food they put on their plate, and teaching their kids that. So that it's in every case, it was exactly that. And I was just really psyched to see that this trend was occurring. This is brand new to me. I had not seen this except in the last 4 years. So yeah, really neat.
Yeah, it is cool. It's sort of an extension, if you will, of the community garden thing going on now, with people just really wanting to just be more attached to, if you will, the cycle of life. I guess is hey, I'm participating in nature this way, in a way that they can feel good about, and as opposed to the evil hunter or whatever. I mean, there's so many stereotypes out there, and there are many bad stereotypes about the urbanite too. The urban person fundamentally has the same instincts a rural person does. We know that, but they don't live the same life, because everything about their environment is different, and their upbringing sometimes is different. But fundamentally, I think that's one thing that people saw when they watched the Survivor shows on TV years ago, was that if you take city people and you make them hungry enough living on a beach, they'll start to look at rats as being food.
Right.
And that sounds extreme and kind of an Armageddon scenario. But in reality, people pretty quickly get over some of their hang-ups about what food is and where it comes from, if they're in a situation where they have to depend on that food supply. And And I applaud these people that aren't yet in that scenario, but they're still saying, hey, I'd like to get closer to where, quote, real food really comes from. And I think that's a positive for all of us.
I agree. Completely agree. I can't believe it, Gordon, but we've made it through over an hour and we didn't even use the acronym CWD.
Well, we could have, but we just didn't.
We didn't. So. We could have, but we didn't. And we used a few other ones, but not that one. So I think we'll save that one for another day. But certainly that's a hot topic, and we talked pre-show, and there's just not enough evidence in any camp to decide what's happening there.
Oh, I totally agree. I think anybody that acts like they have all the answers on CWD right now, I'm going to run away from that person because I'm pretty sure they're not correct.
Right.
There's a lot left to be learned, and it's going to take a while.
Right. Excellent. So if we've raised some more questions than answers, or if people would like to read more about the Brewster buck, how can they reach out to you? How can they find the magazine and read?
Well, the magazine right now is still on the newsstand. We put it out here. There's still some copies out there. We don't put out our next issue. That's the spring issue of North American Whitetail that's on the newsstand now. We don't put out our next issue until the June issue, which will be coming out in May. So there's still a few weeks that you might be able to pick up that spring issue on the newsstand, and it's pretty well scattered all over North America, but especially eastern half of the U.S. So we invite people to read that story, and I think they'll certainly appreciate the deer and appreciate the hunter. And it is part of history. It's definitely part of whitetail history, and we just look forward to engaging with people however we can here at North American Whitetail. If you go to our website, NorthAmericanWhitetail.com, we have a lot of content on there, obviously, and you can hook up with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I mean, we just want to engage people however we can, and we invite questions and photos and whatever else people want to send us.
Very, very cool. Well, I appreciate what you do for the industry. You're a great liaison. You're a role model. I love your work. You definitely make this industry and the world of hunting a much better place. So, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and kind of sharing some of your knowledge and insights and talking about some of the things that I think matter in the deer hunting world.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Jay. I know you know a lot of people, and hearing that from you, that does mean something to me. I think we're all just trying to find a place in the industry that where we feel like we can do some good. If that's to inspire people, to educate them, to inform, whatever you want to say, if it is to be a role model, I mean, you don't have to be in the media to be a role model for hunting. I mean, you just need to follow the rules, be safe, respect the animal and the land, respect the landowner, and if you do all that, whether you kill a big buck or not, you've had a good hunt. And I feel like that's not just something reserved for those of us that are in the media and in the public eye, but we can all do that, and we all need to do that. So I certainly wish everybody a fantastic 2019 season, and I look forward to getting those big buck photos coming in.
Thanks to Gordon Whittington for joining us on the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. Gordon always has this really good vision about what's going on with the real story. Because he's a journalist, he brings facts and thinks way outside the box. For example, he mentioned that if you go back hundreds of years, or you go back to when there were big bucks being killed, there was agriculture. There were big food plots. We just didn't call them food plots then. Back then, they were just called farms. But the deer were feeding on them, and then it's not a big wonder why some of the big deer came long ago when farming was really getting off the ground to feed America. Well, the deer were getting fed too. And with good genetics and multiple generations of deer coming through, you can bet that you're going to get something big out of that. So maybe that's what's to explain here. Dusty, where can we find you when you're not hanging out here in the studios with me?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. BigBuckRegistry.com. You can look me up on Instagram and Twitter at Chasing Antler, Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Jay, where can the people reach out to you? Or you're not on the mic.
Likewise, you can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com, and you can visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Instagram, instagram.com/bigbuckregistry, and YouTube, which is youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. On YouTube, you can listen to all of our podcasts in their entirety. As far as videos are concerned, it's a boring video, but the audio content is there, so you can actually listen to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our live shows that we've done on Thursday nights when we do them, and we've gone back and re-interviewed a lot of our previous guests we had on the show just to put a face to a voice, let's put it that way. You can always listen to our show on other places as well, not just YouTube. We're found on Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. And if you would like to submit a buck to our page for consideration and be featured on our page in front of 250,000 diehard deer hunting fans, all you have to do is go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and all of the instructions will be right there. I think that's pretty much everywhere we're at. I think that's a wrap, Dusty.
That's a whole lot of big buck, Jay.
Sure is. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.